So. Schönen guten Abend allerseits. Herzlich willkommen zu unserer Veranstaltung Eine bessere Zukunft für Europa. Es freut mich, dass diese Veranstaltung auf so sehr großes Interesse stößt. Der Saal hier ist voll für all diejenigen, die das online nicht sehen können. Und ich freue mich sehr, dass wir hier so zahlreich sind, dass wir über dieses sehr, sehr wichtige Thema miteinander sprechen. Und ich begrüße ganz besonders die heute hier eingeladenen internationalen Gäste, die zu uns gekommen sind, um uns hier beizuwohnen. Zu meiner Linken von Ihnen aus gesehen, zu Ihrer Rechten sitzt meine werte Kollegin Patricia Chagnon aus dem EU-Parlament. Sie ist Abgeordnete für den Rassemblement National. Wir haben außerdem aus Rumänien, aus der dortigen nationalen Abgeordnetenkammer, Sorin Titus Muncaciu, der ebenfalls einen Vortrag halten wird. Wir haben zu meiner Rechten, Ihrer Linken, Professor Dr. Zbigniew Krysiak vom Institut für den Schumann-Gedanken in Warschau. Wir haben Gunnar Beck, mein werter Kollege aus dem Europaparlament.
My colleague from the European Parliament. I should also like to welcome Nikolaus Fest from the German delegation. He is the head of the AfD delegation in the European Parliament. I am seeing members of the German Parliament here as well, also colleagues from the constituent state district, also from the Berlin Parliament. I see a well-known face. We have many assistants, many guests, and I would like to extend a very cordial and warm welcome to you. A better future for Europe. This is the title of this event, and this is for good reason. We see and witness that the European Union as it is today, well, has changed so much that the structure of society, economy, it damages these structures. Not only can we talk about the future of the European Union, no, we also have to talk in general terms about a better future for Europe, how to shape it. It may also be a future outside those structures. We already know what is important, that our people, our economies, our continent, our Europe will profit. This morning, we had a very intensive discussion on those matters. The speakers you will hear this evening have been working on this in this area for many years, and thus it will be all the more interesting to hear what they will have to say about this. So, without much ado, I would like to turn over to the first speaker, Patricia Chagnon of the Rassemblement National from the European Parliament. The floor is yours.
Oh, yes. Honourable members of Parliament, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I'm very happy to be with you here today in Germany, in Berlin, a country and a town that I particularly affectionate. Many thanks to the organisers. We had a very good morning of work, and for enabling this conference and this rich and exciting exchange of ideas, which I believe are contributing to the necessary reflection within our national parties and between patriots of all parties in Europe. When we ask the question of direction of the European Union, we must start by following the curve traced by its 70-year-old history. We have just celebrated this event in the European Parliament in Strasbourg last week and try to see where this curve leads us. This curve started 70 years ago, if you believe the official history. It is a little older if we look at the sources that inspired the current construction of Europe. To do this, we need to look at a book written by Coudenhove-Calgary entitled Pan-Europa. The author, who has been somewhat forgotten, although at the time he received the first Prix International de Charlemagne d'Aix-la-Chapelle, the Internationale Karlspreis zu Aachen. This is the oldest and most famous award for commitment to European unification. We are in 1923, and he outlines the prospective considerations for Europe. The author is remarkable for the freshness of his thinking, since his book, written after the Great War, outlines a surprising contemporary vision of the European Union. When you read it, you sometimes forget that it was written a century ago. So familiar are the ideas it sets out to us Europeans living in the 21st century. he speaks of a future European entity that would have broken down its national internal borders, an entity without precise geographical limits, an area of customs union, note the modernity of the terms, of nation-states that would be merged by the virtue of a process of integration, particularly economic integration. An entity built on the model of the Pan-Americanism, which was a union including the South American states and the United States, and a vast program of student exchanges. This reminds us of our contemporary Erasmus, a process that begins with an agreement on coal and steel. He envisages the reunion of the world in a large regional entities in order to finally move, and he barely conceals this, towards a government of the world. He says, it is Europe that we must unite first, and then humanity, a treaty of applied globalism. So what is the situation today? If we look at the history of humanity, an age-old struggle between peoples and nations and empires jumps to the eye. The empire of Alexander, the Roman Empire that conquered us, the Gauls, the Napoleon Empire that turned Europe upside down, the French colonial empire, the USSR, etc. All these empires possessed the necessary resources to survive. But all these empires also had same characteristics that made the same promises and, above all, had the same defects. First of all, they had a centralized and superior authority, a superstructure that dictates the law. Secondly, it was an administration not of individuals, but of populations. Thirdly, they had a firm belief in their superior values. Fourthly, they proclaimed a unifying ideology. Fifthly, the physical and moral capacity to normalize recalcitrant peoples or minds. 6, the idea and concept of creating a new man. And 7, the desire or even the obligation to expand permanently. The Roman Empire never stopped growing, and when it did, the peoples of the empire softened, and the Gauls, who had been warriors, became Gallo-Romans, weakened by the Pax Romana in a territory too vast to defend or be loved. When the Germanic invasions came, these people, devoid of affectio imperialis, were psychologically incapable of defending themselves. And the Western Roman Empire sank. As soon as the empire had no more conquests, no more dreams of expansions to share, it was doomed. At last, of course, empires have a promise of eternity. And so what, will you say to me now that I've put these historical political arguments to you today? Why am I adding these to the debate? Well, we need to realize that the European Union ticks all the boxes that are characteristic of an empire. Let's go over the characteristics of the European Union one by one. Superior authority, well, in the EU, that's called the Commission. It's certainly not a European emperor until they elect a European president, but it is definitely a technocratic nebula. The administration of populations. In the European, we do not speak of citizens of this or of that country, but we speak of citizens of the Union, although there is no such thing as a European people. And above all, we speak of consumers. The EU's firm belief of bearing superior values. Well, union values are constantly invoked, and these soft law values are applied on all occasions and considered superior, even superior to the will of the people, as some referendums have shown, right? These values are then the pretext for universal moral lessons and for obligations imposed on member states. They are used as threats, as reasons for sanctions, or even by the European courts. The EU has a federating ideology. It is a merchant empire with merchant and mercantile values, an ultra-liberal ideology which centers all human activity around trade. For the EU, man is no longer a person rooted in his family, his region, his country, his culture, but an economic agent, a consumer, a producer. The capacity of normalization, although Mrs. von der Leyen does not send tanks as during the days of the Warsaw Pact, and I did think about my words, she does use a very powerful budgetary weapon. Remember, that before the Italian elections, she proclaimed, for example, that she would sanction Italy financially if it voted badly. The emergence of a new man. Well, this new man for the EU is a nomadic man freed from his ties, affections, natural attachments, and cultural references. The desire for permanent expansion. Well, it is a combination of territorial conquest. We see that new membership states is bought in exchange for subsidies, but it is also the expansion of free trade agreements and treaties that allow countries on the other side of the globe to enter this merchant empire without any geographical constraints. The promise of eternity? Well, the idea that the European Union is the ultimate outcome of European history and the perfect institutional order. Europhiles consider this concept unquestionable and even immoral to reconsider. There is no alternative to us, they say. This is the Tina principle, right? There is no alternative. Well, let me tell you, we are Tina. Today, the EU, which is in crisis, has embarked on a fast and furious flight into the future by planning the accession of Kosovo, Croatia, or Ukraine, all countries that are economically and institutionally incompatible with our countries. So why is it so important to analyze the nature of the European Union? Well, because it tells us who we are dealing with. The empire's nation reading grid allows us to understand the developments that await us. Empire means imperialism, that is to say, the subjugation of people, the destruction of entities, identities, and the increasingly oppressive affirmation of an oligarchic power that is far removed from citizens and in the end causes war and general chaos. But it also means, and this will be my conclusion, a programmed end of the European Union as we know it today. Indeed, there is no such thing as an internal empire. By nature, empires are artificial constructions, human constructions built initially maybe through common effort, but ultimately maintained by violence, coercions, threats, and pressure. Empires have always been parentheses in the history of peoples and men. No empire state lasts and none resists the only human reality that is worthwhile, the peoples and their institutionalized form, the nation state. The USSR lasted about 70 years. The European Union has just celebrated its 70 years. I want to see a favorable omen. Tomorrow's Europe will once again be the Europe of peoples and free nations. Thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you so much, dear Patricia, for your opening speech. Thank you so much. The European Union as an empire which, tries to maintain itself alive with some border violence. That's also a model that we have to consider when we talk about political action. How can we go on and with our political actions? We're going to listen to Sorin Titus Muncaccio from the Romanian perspective. Please, the floor is yours, dear Sorin.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I'm a member of the Romanian Parliament and also a representative of the Alliance for United of Romanians. It is a party that actually it's dedicated to the welfare of the Romanian people and also to the self-determination of the Romanian state. Now, I was preparing for a very up-to-date speech, but because we are now talking about this European Union, I have a little research about the history of the European Union, and I found out that the gentleman who actually was dreaming about the European Union, I'm talking about the Jean Monnet, he was a survivor of 3 wars. He was involved in the World War I, World War II, and the Spanish Civil War. And he came up out of those wars with certain ideas that he will put in the European Union architecture. And the first idea was that never again war in Europe, because it seems to him and to us that Europeans are very good in destroying each other countries in wars. So that was the first idea. The second idea was that in this European architecture, democracy should not have a part of. And the reason for that was because either Hitler or Mussolini was elected by due elections. So Jean Monnet was named governor of the Ruhr region in Germany, and he has the job to survey so the Germany will not arm again. But he had the idea and the experience of World War I. He knew the Germans are very determined and very proud people, and they will not accept defeat. Therefore, he had this idea to unite the suspicion of the German and the French by doing this union called the Steel and Cold Union, which gave both sides the chance to survey one another, and this way the peace was ensured. Actually, the survey of the Ruhr region ended up in 1981. But while he was trying to do this architecture, the European Union architecture, he came to the States, in the United States of America, in Washington, D.C., and in 1953, he had a speech in front of the world press at that time. And it's very important because in that speech, he gave the strategy. The American oligarchy asked him, how you are going to convince the European leaders of their countries to give up their sovereignty to get into such an integrated union? And Jean Monnet gave an answer that is valuable to us, as it was in 1953. He said, we are going to give them a little bit of economic advantage, and in the meantime, we are going to subtract a little bit of their sovereignty. It's called the small step strategy. Well, guess what? All the leaders of the European Union, Ms. Merkel, the leader of the European Bank, all mentioned in their talk this little step strategy. And that's what it is. Look at this resilient fund, right? They, for instance, in my particular case, Romania, they give us a little bit of financial support, but they ask us to give up all our coal industry, energy, to switch directly to the clean energy, and so on. So if you think about it, it is exactly what they are, what is the promise of the European Union. Give a little bit of economic advantage or integration, but take and subtract the sovereignty. And that's our problem. Our party do not agree with the sovereignty point. Now, the main speech that I was trying to prepare was about this global architecture, global system, Malthusian system that the oligarchy set upon us. And I was trying to find out why is the reason, why in the highest world institution, the science and the scientists are replaced by obedient bureaucrats, because that's how they do it. How is possible for systems like, I came back to the history. It was the Warren Congress, American Congress Warren Commission. There was inquiring into the Kennedy assassination. And what did they do? They got some framework from the Congress directing them to a certain line of research, but not allowing them to other avenues. And this strategy is called the terms of reference. So the inquiry commissions, doesn't matter if they have scientists or politicians, they have a predetermined outcome. It's called the terms of reference. The same thing happened to IPCC Commission, right? The UN bureaucrats establish a terms of reference saying you can study the human impact on climate change. IPCC Commission is an international platform for climate change. That's what it is. So you can study the human impact on climate change, but you are not allowed to look to the other phenomena, like, I don't know, the spots on the sun, the tilt of the magnetic field, to the, I don't know, Milankovitch effect, or any other factors that are influencing the climate. So what happened was, because of this predetermined terms of reference, the outcome was clear. The humans are responsible for climate change. And from that came the second commission, who established the rules, the policy recommendations. And with those policy recommendations, we got the absurdity of carbon certificates, billion market, right? We got the carbon footprint, absurdity. But also, we got the laws of decarbonization in the European Union. And that's the way they try to stop the industrial engine of the Western nations. Because the energy sector is very important. If you start shutting down the power plants based on oil, gas, and coal, you bet you stop the engine of development and the industrial engine. And actually, I remember a gentleman, his name was an architect of this IPCC commission. His name was Maurice Strong. And he said, how we can shut down the engine of the European industrial architecture, industrial economies. Well, if you want to shut down an engine, the first thing you can do is to squeeze the gas pipe. Well, they tried that in 1970s, when the price of oil went to the roof and were not really having enough gas for the cars. The tail were, I don't know if you remember, but I'm old enough to remember those times, when it was car for long, long distances. That was the time of the oil embargo. But there is another way you can shut down an engine, and that's to stop the exhaust. What does it mean to stop the exhaust? What it means is you convince people that CO2, the gases that get from the exhaust, are detrimental to the climate, and that's how you do it. So you convince people with something that is not true. It's not true that the carbon dioxide is the one, the culprit for the climate change. It's only 4% of the atmosphere. And besides that, there is a lot of discussion about the CO2 as a factor for plant growth and etc. So that's how they do it. They either squeeze the pipe or they block the exhaust. And this is a Malthusian philosophy that actually it's upon us. Thank you very much.
Vielen lieben Dank.
Thank you so much, dear Zorin Titus Moncaccio. Thank you so much for your words. And he was explaining us how Jean Monnet, how he wanted a step-by-step enlargement of the European Union and giving away of national sovereignty, and how different forums and bodies try to exert influence upon our economies, upon the way we act. By the way, I was always wondering, what about the architecture of this building? What is the whole meaning of this? And someone said, I don't know if that's true, it's a diesel engine, that is going to... So actually, we are now in the piston of the diesel motor. So this is exactly what the European Union is trying to destroy, So as a matter of fact, maybe that could serve as quite a powerful image, so much for German sovereignty or German industrial sovereignty that is being destroyed. All this could have, had a different outset, and this brings us to the next words of presentation. We are going to listen to Zbigniew Krysiak, who is, for example, chairman of the Robert Schuman Institute, that deals with the Robert Schuman philosophy. Robert Schuman. So it is about the meaning and the content that could have been the meaning and the content of the European Union. So we're going back to the origin, back to the roots for the European Union and what this could mean for us and our work in the future. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed for the invitation. I have given the title of my speech, Let's Return to Schuman's Europe. And under the title is Schuman's model will save Europe against destruction and ensures good and stable development. So currently Schuman became a venerable servant of God on the 19th of June last year. Pope was finished basically the formal beatification process, and now we are waiting for miracle. So you can pray for his intercession, and if we, go back from that superstate direction or empire, as Patricia was talking about, so this can be, assumed as a miracle, so that not to go to the hell. So this is, some very important, statements, and I think the reference books are written by Schuman for Europe, and in Deutsch title für Europa, and as well, I am referring to a very good book, Margaret Crittenburg, from the University of Hague, very good and excellent, content of, I think, most important, issues and the references. And this can be basically used as a reference because, you have probably met many interpretations which are basically very much indeed not true, or they are basically spelling that what Schuman really spoke. And Schuman never organized or established the European Union. So Schuman established the Community of European Nations. Schuman established a Community of European Nations. He didn't want the European Union because he knew that the Union is a kind of a uniform. He wanted Europe united. He wanted Community of European Nations. And basically, in his time was acting Artiello Spinelli, who wanted basically destroy the Europe and create a superstate, remove the national institutions, remove the national culture, traditions, and just create some uniform which doesn't, remind us at all any European tradition, any Christian tradition we have. So in the Treaty of Maastricht, 1992, first time appears the name European Union. Before, there was a before there was a economic, community of Europe, and Schuman was going basically to create develop certain areas of activity in Europe in the mode of community. So, and finally, in Amsterdam Treaty 1997, there is a more deep, direction we can observe, a deep direction towards the superstate. So Schuman, basically his main objective was just to, implement the unity, solidarity, and peace. This is kind of a logic implication. Unity, united, then if we are united, then we are going to be solidar. Solidar, it means, sharing the properties, goods, to be partners in the different, areas, social areas, and as well the economic areas. So he said the implication, if we are solidar, then we can, obtain the peace. If there is not unity, there will be not solidarity. If there will be not solidarity, we cannot obtain the peace. So if there is not peace, there is a war. There is a war in different forms. The war, where you use the tools of a capital, of a power, and so on. And 5 basic, areas Schuman was basically hesitating and developing. There are like a freedom, solidarity, diversity, patriotism, and the Christianity. And he basically said very important, expressed very important statement about the concept of the Community of European Nations, saying that my idea is not to merge states to create a superstate. Our European states are a historical reality. From a psychological point of view, it would be impossible to do away with them. Their diversity is a good thing, and we do not intend to level them down or equalize them. So this is very important, because some people misinterpreting, saying, yes, Schuman wanted to create a federal Europe. No, he is very, clearly saying, in that statement, in that book, so just let's, speak about that based on that statement. And very important thing he just as well described, speaking about the patriotism. To our mind, European policy is certainly not in contradiction with the patriotic ideal. It encourages the particular nature and characteristics of each of its states and fosters the sound love for one's own country, which is a love that does not go in detriment of other countries. It wants to attain a unity in the fullness of its diversity. So it means he's just rooted in the Christian, values. So if you love, your country, it would be contradictory if you express, I hate others. So the love is love. You cannot love somebody and hate another party. So this is a very important, statement. So, and finally, we can draw some, to the comparison reasons, some 3 models to distinguish what is the difference, between the Community of European Nations, superstate, and so-called nation of self-oriented. So the Community of European Nations, as I said, sometimes we hear the sentence or just wording, the Europe nations of Europe. Nations of Europe. Europe of nations. So what that means, you have a set of elements where each element doesn't have a common area, common set with the others. So they are not related. Sometimes if you are not related with your husband, right, you do not develop this relationship, then you became estranged. When you approach some certain problems, then he becomes your enemy. And then goes to the war and to a divorce. And the same is if you have a Europe of nations, they are not common sets, not relations. Sometimes they go to the point to basically fight and go to the war. So the community of European nations, according to Schuman, there is a set of elements where each of them have a common area with the others. So relations. Schuman said relations, relations, and relations. The institutions and the economy is not most important if you do not develop, the relations. So you cannot, create and develop the love to the others if you do not have a relations. In marriages, we know very well. If you are not related with your husband or with your wife, you cannot say about the love. So you cannot say about the partnership, about the friendship. So this is a very important, a concept Schuman basically have drawn on that. And the superstate is basically a centralized approach. This is uniform throughout Europe. This is solidarity of supranational elites, pan-European oligarchy. This is a formal democracy, but oligarchy is, in that on the top. And the solidarity, basically, as I said already, they say, we want, develop the solidarity, but only between these oligarchs and the guys who are on the top. And this is, in case of Europe of nations of Europe or Europe of nations, this is basically is a very heavy point, is that solidarity above all in the nation, but the solidarity not with others, diversity between nations and uniformism within the nations, and then appears that what is sometimes very negatively described, nationalism. Nationalism is in that means that you love your wife and hate the brothers of your wife. So you love your country, you love Germany, but you say, I hate, for instance, France. So, look, this egoistic basically comes out from that, basically concept, from that model, very much indeed, points and areas to develop the egoism. So if we just analyze what is happening today, as Patricia said as well my colleague, about that how many areas we can identify as an area of egoism, as areas a lack of solidarity. The many cases we can, present nowadays, not only last year when the war on Ukraine started, right, but as well, in the process of this crisis on the energy market and so on and so on. So what I think to come to the basically conclusion is that, the fundamentals, we can of course speak about the different important issues, how to shape, the institutions, how to solve the problem with the transformation of energy, protecting the borders, and many, many other areas. But if the fundamentals are wrong, we cannot build the house because this house fall down. If the fundamentals in the marriage are wrong, you know, it takes 2 months or 1 year, yeah, and this, you know, relationship falls down. And, you know, at the at the end, I just would like, you know, to quote Schumann, obtaining his basically power from the God. He was just server in politics, Jesus' disciple in politics. The church, you know, in the prayer, in intercession of Schumann, name his as a Jesus' disciple in politics. So I wish all great, you know, my colleagues here in the European Parliament, everywhere in all countries, that you try to become a disciple in the politics. Just follow Schumann. Just establish, you know, Schumann groups everywhere. Just educate about Schumann, because Schumann said, we are all certainly imperfect tools of providence that uses us to great things for which our own forces would be insufficient. This awareness obliges us to great modesty, but on the other hand, it offers us inner peace, which would not be justified if we perceive our personal experience only from a purely terrestrial point of view. Thank you very much.
Vielen herzlichen Dank.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So you've shown us where the original origins were, you know, what is meant to be, not a super state, but rather a cooperation of sovereign nations. Now, we're not the only ones who talk about the future of Europe. For this purpose, the EU Commission has organize a EU conference on the future, where, of course, not any citizens that were democratically elected would have a say, but is probably a randomly selected, probably quoted selection of citizens. You know, we had a gender quota and the age quota and whatever we had. I don't even want to go into all the possibly communistic models that they were trying to implement. And this selection of so-called citizens were to think about what the future of Europe is going to look like, you know, dedicated the future of the European Union, for that matter. And you can imagine, you know, the huge gap of ideas that they would produce to what we have just heard. And Gunnar Beck, he was there, and you know, you can already tell from his face, you know, what he thought about this, and he's going to share his thoughts and ideas with this. Gunnar, the floor is yours. Thank you so much, dear Norbert. Thanks to everyone. Can everyone hear me? Oh, I thought my pressure on my finger is too weak. Well, I hope everyone can hear me. Well, thanks so much for coming. Maybe two things before I start. First of all, I'd like to ask for your forgiveness, Mr. Glaser and others. You know, you probably already listened to my words this morning, maybe even twice, so my apologies for that. So maybe I can, you know, give something new to you as well. And do something off the cuff, so to say. And the second thing, with regards to bureaucratic considerations, you know, maybe I should embed my bureaucratic considerations into what I want to say. I'm going to say this in English, so the other ones can follow, and afterwards I switch back to German. I think Mr. Gunnar Beck doesn't know that the interpreters are here, but that's fine.
Lining were two models of European, shall we say, cooperation or integration. One is a voluntary one, a Europe of nations, and the other we could describe as a constructivist one, which is integrationist. And I think it's quite, if I'm wrong, please correct me. One is imperialist, the latter, and the former respects diversity. The imperialist tends towards violence, or at least recreation. The national one would tend to respect national divergencies. Also ganz kurz, ich entnahm den vorher.
Very briefly, from what I gathered from the speakers before, I think we're dealing with two ideas of European form of cooperation. The first one, seemingly the idea by Mr. Robert Schuman, I'm not really sure about that 100%, but it underlines the diversity of the individual nations, and the cooperation is on a volunteer basis compared to the rather imperialistic model, that actually really doesn't want this diversity, wants to, put an end to this diversity of nations. And now I would like to say my actual words on the conference, or share my thoughts on the conference on the future of Europe. That really happened. I really want to be very clear of the model that they tend to. So since 2009, which was the year where the Beck, where the still Lisboa Treaty was enforced, the EU had their own competences. And competence is very, a mild form of actually the form. So what they did, they extended their competences, saving the EU by common liability, by monetary state funding in a magnitude that has been unprecedented in the migration, health policies, and also with regards to commonly causing deaths. Each and every of these extensions of these powers or pretentious assumptions of powers took place without any basis or contracted basis, and hence it goes against the contracts and treaties, because it's not really any competencies that were transferred to the member states. So hence we are dealing with Article 5 of the EU treaties. It is actually against the competencies of the member states, and it is an illegal adoption of power. So with this, actually, they declare the EU as a federal state. And this was the original goals of what happened in 2020, of the inauguration of office from Ursula von der Leyen on the Conference of the Future of Europe. And this is also reflected in the final recommendations of this conference on the future of Europe. Together with this, they want to impose the transnational list for the next European elections. And they want, first, doing away the national veto with regards to fiscal policies and also foreign and defense policies. Second, they want to create a EU army, EU military forces. They don't do it now. They put it on a hold, but I shall say probably, till they are ready to do so. And third, they want to have further saying and competences with regards to health politics and educational politics. But, we have to want this first. And we also have to talk about the funds, are they in an unlimited way? Fourth, the abolishment of the term illegal immigrations and the extension of the Dublin system by a new EU migration pact. Nicholas Fiss is going to talk about this later as well. And fifth, the green transformation of the national economy, subsidies, creating regulatories for and favorizing green energies with regards to conventional industries. Normally, you would need fundamental changes of contracts, and you would need the consent of all member states to do so. But in Germany, we have 90% of the German parliament, that are lost in their integration delusions, or unless I'm wrong, please correct me. And the Constitutional Court, constitutional court that is actually elected by the government. You know, we can, of course, count with a consent. However, in Denmark, for example, you always need such a substantial change of contracts and national referendum. However, the Hungarian government, you know, did not give the consent to these ideas, and they didn't want to put it into national law. Now, the EU Parliament, you know, they avoid all this. They avoid all these steps, you know. Think back to the first attempts of a EU constitution. Back then I was working for the EU Parliament, you know, under the French President Chagnon. You know, he established a convention, and it was the idea to bring the European Union closer to the citizens. But what he actually did, Giscard, you know, after 2 years, he was creating some sort of EU constitutional reform treaty that luckily failed because there's a veto by the Dutch. If they hadn't, you know, we would have had this EU constitutions, and it would have been possible by Ursula von der Leyen. But they didn't want to do this this procedure, you know, bearing all the risks, you know, because they knew that there would be so many different procedures for ratification. They would rather go to a simplified versions based on the Lisbon treaties. So in the so-called simplified amendment procedures, you know, by doing away with the competencies of the national governments, they want to implement legislation changes that are played down by the European Commission and then by the European Court of Law. This is also something that needs to be taken for granted. They will play it down as well. So step by step, as a consequence, we are going to see the far-reaching consequences, like we've seen it all. First of all, no one notices, and once, you know, everything has been adopted, it's way too late. The reasoning or the justification for this simplified contractual change procedure was, well, we don't need assistants and speakers, you know, it's not necessary because we already have the recommendations of the Commission because they are already democratically legitimized. You know, what this means, you know, democratically legitimized in Ursula von der Leyen terms, well, maybe we should have a closer look at this, and we see two aspects very clearly. First of all, the so-called civic participation as a new form of a democratic suggestion with regards to the conference on the future of Europe. There we had 800 participants, so-called anonymous participants. But very clearly we saw the very close linkage of these participants to EU organizations, you know, and this is all disguised and not closed up. So I have been demanding the directory and the clear data on the persons of all those present, and I'm always put down with referring to data protection rules. But then we have the agency Kantar, you know, who has been in service for the European Union and a subsidiary for the bank, private equity, capital investment. So we don't know who is there. We don't know who is participating. It is said that all of them have been called randomly, and it's a fifth. Then we say a fifth of names that were present at the plenary sessions, at the working group sessions. And then they have been elected, but we did our research and we found out that lots of those who were selected, so-called selected, were actually belonging to EU close associations and lobbyist groups, you know? So some of them were probably called randomly. However, the probability the probability that those who are in favor of EU integration, would go there, and of course, the probability is much higher that these EU integrationists favorizing people would go there, especially after a defeat in the Netherlands. In Strasbourg at 2010, on Thursday night, they had these briefings, so-called briefings, and then we had the so-called Spinelli experts that were briefing the participants, and on Friday and Saturday, they would have those plenary sessions. So when you're coming from Eastern Europe, not a lot of them, of course. So when you're coming from Eastern European countries, you had to go there Wednesday or Thursday, very early in the morning. So for people who are actually having a job, impossible. So these were the conditions, and this was the framework. And it is not a surprise that almost all of those participants had already retired, or there were students, or there were lifelong activists for the European cause. So after 10 plenary session days, the citizens were briefed not only on Thursday night by these Spinelli experts. Maybe we should add this information. Spinelli was a communist, and he is honored. He's an honorable position in both European parliaments, in Strasbourg and in Brussels. But I'm always careful with comparing things to communism. Lots of the things that are going on in Brussels are much worse, but let's not even go there. So these Spinelli experts, they're explaining in very great detail where the problems would arise from an expertise perspective, and hence the EU is the solution. So the only thing you need to do is change in the contracts in order to make sure that Brussels gets the power to implement their solution. So during the plenary sessions and the working group sessions, the citizens were in constant exchange. We had chat groups among each other and with experts. So they were been sending comments and remarks, and then they could put them in as criticism, or they would also be appeared to come up with their criticism about whatever was debated. So with this, as a result, it was supposed to look like everyone wanted a EU superstate. So in the beginning of May in Strasbourg, it was the beginning of May, some of these citizens asked me to talk to them, a handful. They were saying, we're sorry that, we couldn't utter our criticism during the plenary sessions, but we were afraid of getting problems. Also, before each and every plenary sessions, they were told what to say. So once you would utter criticisms, you would be struck off the list of speakers. So no, we know that what they wanted to do was the plans very similar to Macron and Ursula von der Leyen. So nothing is a coincidence. All of this has been meticulously orchestrated. So it doesn't come as a surprise that nearly all of these 800 participants are pro-EU. One of the citizens from my working group dealing with migration, she said, well, it's nice for you all being pro-EU at home. This is not a fact. Maybe we would only have EU friends who would want to participate in such a conference. All the others would be outraged or bothered or wouldn't be bored to even come here. So this is not a representation of true EU citizens, because they're either hand-selected or just selected. Well, at the beginning of the conference, and this is something I want to add, Mrs. von der Leyen said, the citizens could propose their suggestions. They don't have to do it in person. And we also invite the citizens, beyond these 800 participants, because we have a multilingual platform, and 50,000 people did this, although the user-friendliness wasn't really given. So it is actually just only 0.01% of the EU citizens but however, much more than the 800 citizens, which is a 0.0018%. So, neglectable. Who would go regularly to Strasbourg when the other ones had to work? On this platform, we had the following ideas and considerations and fears. First of all, border security and rejection of immigration. Then, consumer goods. And so the citizens were very worried. And third, the climate. The citizens were actually wishing for climate policies that would secure their prosperity. Of course, the actual goals look very different, and due to this great mass of critical voices and these preferences that were just so different than the opinions uttered at this reunion of 800 participants, these what has been said on this platform has been deleted. So what can we draw from this, the result of this conference? You know, whether it's called like this, you know, the result is going to, the goal of this is an EU federal state with a EU constitution, and we have to prevent this. But how are we going to do this? We at the European Parliament cannot do this, because here we have 75 to 80%, you know, of all the deputies who are green, even if they have a different name or they call themselves something different. So I think we still could do it at the German Parliament, at the Bundestag, because here we cannot do it either, because here we have 89% who are Greens or whatever they call themselves. So this is doomed to fade, but I don't really want to resign completely. The only way how we can do it is reach out to the public, you know, raising awareness among them, and this is important, doing this together with all nationalists and right-wing parties, and do it together with the Eastern European friends, because I think after 3.5 years that I've been working in Brussels, I think they haven't completely lost their mind, yeah? And what they are planning here, and we should all be aware of what they are planning. By the way, I studied philosophy amongst many other things, so I want to give you a little anecdote here. And there's a very famous book that was written by a French author with Russian root, Alexandre Krysiak, introduction to the lectures of Hegel's, and he, like many other philosophers before, he thought to have solved all the problems of the world, so he left university, and then he got together with a friend, I suppose he was. You know, he was someone who also lectured at French universities. He asked to be sent to the European Commission, and with the intention to administrate the last man there, yeah. And I think this is really similar, yeah. That is really similar to what we're seeing, yeah. So with this, I would like to close. Thank you very much.
Ja, vielen lieben Dank.
Thank you very much, Gunnar, for your explanations on the Conference for the Future. Indeed, this is not the future we envisage for the European Union, a simulation of democracy, but this is where we're heading at in the European Union, because they want to continue with the citizens' participation, and the transnationalists are on the rise. This means they're ever further away from the citizens and the European Union and the politics that are going on there. So what would a good future for Europe look like? Now we talked about what we reject, and we also explained what Europe could have been in historical terms and what European collaboration could have been. And we as AfD party in the German parliament always choose the path that we want to choose with our European partners. We have to put the citizen in the limelight. People, others would say, we have to put people, the individual, in the center. It's always the same. Democracy means the rule of the people. Rule of the people is also shown in elections, but these elections have to have something to decide upon. And in the last EU Commission presidency election, it wasn't an election, it was actually a nomination. And we saw what democracy looks like on the European level. We had Mr. Weber as a candidate, we had Mr. Timmermans as a candidate, and we had Vestager as a candidate. And at the end of the day, it was Ursula von der Leyen who rose to the throne, and nobody ever saw her name on the election slip or had ever heard her name when they went to the ballot. So the vote was cast for a relatively anonymous party. Everything will be ever more anonymous with the European parties, which are more and more in the focus. And nobody was able to take a final decision. If you have 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% politicians who are green, your vote sooner or later will not matter any longer. Also, in the national arena, especially in the German parliament, we see that many projects from the European Commission are simply regarded as too large for the nation state. These are the projects with the new slogan, European added value. So theoretically, people assume if something is done or would be done on European level, this will have some kind of advantage, maybe economies of scale or whatever. And quite often problems are oversized. We've seen this with migration. Migration is a huge issue. European migration agenda has been on the table for years at the European Commission. It really wants to push it through with clear rates, percentages, which obligations to accept migrants with human rights standards. The citizens are not asked whether they want to have a home for asylum seekers in their backyard. They are not asked whether their social welfare systems use up their taxes to feed these people. So this problem is too large for the nation state, too large for the citizen is what they say. Another topic is climate. CO2 emissions. We will soon die because of the CO2 emissions. This is such an urgent, huge issue, and thus a nation state cannot decide which emissions it shall emit. No, we need a Paris Agreement, an IPCC, which will define how climate change made by man is expressed. And at the end of the day, industry in Germany will destroy it, because the European Union wants it with a taxonomy, Green Deal, and Build Back Better. And probably they chose this concept because they really want to build back industry. We've seen it with COVID. What was told to us by the World Health Organization, a trickle-down effect via the EU down to the nation states. People were locked up, borders were closed, EU COVID certificates were issued, and it's not for allowing you to travel or it's not allowing you to have freedoms. No, these certificates are there to ensure that the digital certificate is there to really deprive you of all of your freedoms. And the question now arises, what is sovereignty? Sovereignty as highest power, sovereignty of competence of competencies, which means that you assign competencies to a certain person. Or Carl Schmitt's definition, sovereignty means those who decide on emergency situations. And now legally and politically we arrive at different questions, because the German parliament indeed defined the pandemic of national significance, and then the constituent states passed decrees, and politically the pandemic and the resulting emergency was neither decided on the level of the constituent states or in the German parliament. These decisions were taken on the international and European level. And for that very reason, the approach for a better future of Europe, for a better future of the citizens, indeed, is to put the citizen in our focus, to remember that you as people, as citizens, have a rule, that you have direct participation. And if you see it in a different way, Never will we have the model of a European empire. No, we want to have the path of a community of European nations, because democracy in a nation still works within the election systems. And here a citizen can elect the representative he wants, whom he might know and understand. This is different with transnational lists. And in Germany, all of a sudden, I elect someone from Portugal, from Bulgaria, from Estonia, and this person doesn't even speak my language. He doesn't know my culture, and this person simply appears on a list. So we need this link to democracy and connection between the citizens and the authorities, those who are elected. And this is the foundation for every freedom. If you look back into history and look at Thomas Hobbes, and Thomas Hobbes write about the Leviathan, and this was with basics for state theory. He assumed that human beings are a wolf, homo homine lupus. We know this from history and Latin lessons. What does this mean? Without a state, without a safety net, it was the monarch, the king in the past. So you need a kind of set of common rules. Without such rules, you won't be safe. Otherwise, you will end up in shackles. And John Locke even added, liberty is only possible with such a set of rules and this order. And the European Union is working on dissolving and undermining these orders and these set of rules by setting up a supranational rule, and where the people actually don't know what the rules are. And we as representatives have difficulties with all of a sudden 400 rules and laws to be adopted by the European Union are showered upon us, and then all of a sudden we're supposed to amend a directive and they will be transposed into national law. But why are we supposed to use a European directive on minimum wage or on social welfare systems, where the EU Commission would like to have a say as to how we structure our own social welfare systems? So a better future for Europe will only be created with a Europe of citizens, citizens living in national states, in national communities, and that's where they will be able to take their decisions. And those nations, based on the mandate that they have at home, they can decide whether they want to enter into bilateral or multilateral negotiations and groups, and whether they want to execute certain projects or whether they want to reject such projects. This is the foundation of our Europe of tomorrow. Peace, mutual acceptance, yes. But forced solidarity, a unification on a European level, no. And how did the citizens profit from the European Union? It's quite interesting to look at statistics at the GDP in Germany and to which extent it rose. I looked at this in 10-year intervals, and in the 1960s, 1970s, within 10 years, our GDP increased threefold, and then it decreased down to plus 150%, then down to plus 50%, and with the integration steps of Maastricht, at the end of the day, we arrived at only 20% increase within 10 years. And now we have to be happy if within this decade, in the 20s, we have any economic growth at all. So the increasing integration into the European Union, which is always sold to us as an engine for wealth, has decelerated our GDP, has increased our state debt. Our target 2 has exploded, and the value of our currency has been minimized, and the power of our industry has been destroyed, and the gap between rich and poor has been expanded in such a way you wouldn't have been able to imagine 10 or 20 years ago. Today, young people are no longer able to afford a single-family home, even if both parents are working. Even then, they can't afford it. This is a reality which the European Union, this structure, created this reality, and we wouldn't have had such a reality with our concept. And this is why we have to continue on this path. I'm looking forward to our dialogue, particularly with you, our partners. We've discussed these matters this morning. We want to tread this path together, a path that is not the path of the European Union, but a path of the union of sovereign nations which use democracy and take account of their citizens. Thank you very much. Nikolaus, you're looking at me. You can make a comment if you like. Hello, everybody, and I'm very pleased that you are here, Peter Böhringer. So, you quoted Schumann, Mr. Krysiak. You said without solidarity we will have war. This might be true, but my colleague Kleinwächter also said another word has ended up as lip service. Basically, it only shows the contrary. Called solidarity, when used in the EU, it's nothing else but moral blackmailing to make sure that you can line your pockets with German money. And I believe that with this solidarity, and if we stick to it, not only will we end up with war, I believe we already have a war. We are in war, basically war against Europe, and particularly against Germany and against future generations. So how do I arrive at this conclusion? Well, this war is a war within, namely our coalition in Germany, and they are no longer interested in sovereignty. They're no longer interested in maintaining the German culture. They gave up this idea. And also this war comes from outside. It comes from several players. It comes from the ECB and the EU. And you can tell from the absurd discussion we had on diesel engines several years ago and the development of a technology where Germany was really leading, and now we are looking at battery electric vehicles, and diesel engines have been stopped. But we all know that the BEV vehicles cannot be produced in sufficient numbers, and we won't see this electrification. I visited Japan recently, and I talked with the top manager of Toyota, and the Japanese have 62 million vehicles, and we have 52 electric vehicles. And then he said if we want to electrify 52 million vehicles, we need 200 new nuclear power plants. Otherwise, we won't have any battery electric vehicles. And there's another issue. Some of the material you need, graphite and so on, if we tried to import such raw materials to produce the batteries, we will need, for some of those rare earths, we need the annual production that is 30,000 times higher. And you can see these are delusions. These are figments of your imagination. And of course, this attack comes from the ECB and the EU. It's called a transfer union, a debt union, inflation, where the ECB is quite hesitant to act. We can tell from the loss in interest gains. And Peter Böhringer, I think it's now 1 billion for German people and their savings accounts, and then also Target 2 situation. I think now we have 1.6 billion in outstanding receivables, and this intervention certainly comes from the EU and the ECB, and this attack probably also comes from the Americans. And the Americans currently are employing every effort to transfer the German industry to America. And let's just say Nord Stream 2. And again, people wonder who broke the pipeline. And it's quite astounding that the EU isn't interested at all to investigate this explosion. There's also an attack regarding Africa. Africa has many angry young men. They can't or don't want to supply for their young men. Anyway, they don't want to share with them, and thus they push them over to Germany, send them to us, and this means So their problem which they have in their own countries, because they have an angry youth, and the youth, once they relocate to Germany, ensure that these young men will transfer German money back to Africa. Nobody talks about cause and effect, and the root cause right here is that the African countries have terrible rulers. And then there's also an intervention of our beloved neighbors. Mr. Krysiak, if Poland asks us for 1.2 billion euros in reparations, I believe that this is not friendly, particularly because this demand is violating existing treaties that have been closed after the Second World War. But of course, we can talk about this. Well, we can talk about this right now. But if you come up with the term solidarity and simultaneously a neighboring country is in breach with existing treaties and comes up with significant financial demands, we must wonder what the actual meaning of solidarity is. And regarding Patricia, we talked about this briefly. And now I'm coming to my solution. Now, what can we do? What can we do against this attack? And of course, Peter Böhring knows more about those issues because he's a financial expert in the UK. The funds and the state bank, that is the gold reserves, were transferred to the financial ministry, and the state bank was turned into a limited with 180,000 euros in equity. So if the state goes broke, 180,000 euros are there as liability. And thank God they shifted their gold to the ministry and saved their gold reserves, because they are no longer under liability. And you can criticize Chancellor Scholz. And finally, they started to take out loans and make debts, because so far the deal was the other countries take out debt and the ECB is officially liable for the debt. But basically, the Germans are the guarantor, because the Germans are too stupid to understand what's going on. And as we've seen recently with Olaf Scholz, after the 100 billion special funds, special assets, as we call it, on top now he agreed to 2 billion for energy costs. And Mr. Draghi all of a sudden was very nervous, because Mr. Draghi knew that sooner or later financial markets would give up and would leave the system if Germany would go broke and if debt was too high. And now, witnessing the deindustrialization of Germany, well, Germany will then soon end up and it will be transformed from a net payer into a net recipient, because you know that the contributions to the EU are calculated based on the wealth of each country. I'm exaggerating a bit, but I believe that we should really bring some fire into the discussion. And therefore, the option would be, we were always in favor. We were never liked the euro. We dislike the euro, but now we say sooner or later the euro will be beneficial to us. I know this might sound strange, a bit crazy, but given the incredible, huge figures, 100 billion, then 200 billion of euros, and now we're talking about such huge figures when dealing with target 2, and the wages and salaries basically aren't able to keep up with this development and the inflation. And then sooner or later you will have to pay back the debt, or we will have a huge catastrophe in the economy. And yes, that's the most probable situation, that we'll have a crash and collapse. So what is European solidarity about? People are always talking about it. What's the worth of European solidarity if basically we are subject to multiple attacks? It applies not only to Germany, but also to Netherlands and other countries. And the ECB and the EU have no inhibitions any longer to ensure that basically our lights are turned off in Europe.
Vielen Dank, lieber Nikolaus.
Thank you so much, dear Nicholas. Yeah, you mentioned that you want to fire the discussion. As a matter of fact, we are going to have a round of discussion, but this is not going to be broadcast into the internet. This is one of the rules that we have as a parliamentary group. So now I want to seize the opportunity to thank all of those who have joined us online. I hope you all have a wonderful evening.